Okay, welcome to the webinar, Incident Response Plans, the Emergency Shutoff Control for Cyber Risk. Next slide. So our agenda for today, we're going to go through a little bit of housekeeping, go ahead and introduce our presenters, share a little bit of information about ConexxusWebinar, and then we'll allow for some time for questions after the presentation. Next slide. So the webinar is now being recorded and it will be made available in approximately 30 days. The link to our YouTube is youtube.com/ConexxusOnline, and the slide deck will be provided if you complete the short survey that will be given to you after the webinar. Every attendee is on mute, so if you have any questions, there is a panel on the right side of your screen where you can enter in your questions. We will be answering these questions at the end of the presentation, but please no vendor-specific questions. If you have any further questions, you can email info@conexxus.org. Next slide, please. Today's presenters, my name is Allie Russell. I work as an intern for ConexxusWebinar, and the speakers for today are Chris Leitz, Principal of Coalfire, and Tabitha Grenier, Chief Security Officer at Acumera. Next slide. So a little bit about ConexxusWebinar. We are an independent, nonprofit, member-driven technology organization setting standards in data exchange, security, and mobile commerce, as well as providing vision in identifying emerging technologies and trends. We also advocate for our industry. Technology is policy. Next slide. Please join us for our next free webinar on September 15th, 2016 on Protecting Retail ATMs, a guide to preventing and detecting skimming. Following that, there will be a free webinar on November 17th, 2016 on cybersecurity. Next slide. Join ConexxusWebinar in Atlanta for Technology Edge at the NACS show on October 18th through the 21st, 2016. You can visit nacshow.com/technologyedge for more information. Next slide. Also, join ConexxusWebinar in Annapolis, Maryland for the 2017 ConexxusWebinar Annual Conference on April 23rd through the 27th, 2017. So today's webinar is on Incident Response Plans, the Emergency Shutoff Control for Cyber Risk. And now I'd like to turn it over to Chris and Tabitha.
Hello everyone. So today Chris and I are going to be talking about incident response and how you can be better prepared. I also am going to attempt to launch a couple polls, so hopefully I don't fail tremendously. The questions are going to be how many of you have a documented incident response plan? And for those of you that do have a documented incident response plan, how many of you have actually tested the plan in the last year? So I'm going to kick off the first, which is how many of you have a documented incident response plan. So in today's webinar, we're going to look at why everyone should have an incident response plan and how you would go about developing, implementing, and testing your incident response plan. I am now, before we get started, I'm going to give you a couple more minutes on that first poll. So the first question is why? Why should you have an incident response plan? So breaches often show up in headlines and can have a multitude of negative impacts to your business. So many of the recent breaches, which I've actually updated this slide in the last couple days, that you may have heard about include POS malware, remote access solutions, and capturing of passwords through multiple methods, whether that's electronic or social engineering. So what do we know about some of the recent attacks? So you may have heard about the Oracle Micros notification. So in August, Oracle notified customers that malicious code had been found on certain microsystems and that they're investigating a possible breach. Visa also issued a security alert in regards to the possible compromise of Oracle microsystems. And they also released what are known as IOCs, or indicators of compromise, that you should look for to help determine if you have an issue. For example, IP addresses that were involved in previous attacks. Eddie Bauer, which was announced on August 18th, that their point-of-sale systems were affected by malware and that payment card information may have been compromised somewhere between January and July of this year. Wendy's is not as recent as those, but relative recent because they actually acknowledged recently that at least 1,000 locations were affected. Their initial estimates were much lower, and they've stated the breach was a result of a service provider's remote access credentials being compromised. And they actually discovered unusual card activity in January, but they were still having stores that were affected all the way into June. So these are just a few examples. There are obviously plenty more examples out there, and incidents and breaches are occurring with escalating frequencies, so it's very important that you're prepared so that you can minimize the impacts. I am going to close the first poll. And I'm going to show you the results here. So it looks like we're about 57% have a documented incident response plan, 33% does not have a documented incident response plan, and about 10% are unsure. So maybe 60 have, and 40 don't or are unsure. Okay, and I can't figure out how to launch the second poll. So I will try later. So attacks. There are some great sources of information out there, such as the Verizon 2016 Data Breach Investigation Report, shortened to the DBIR, the Ponyman's 2016 Cost of Data Breach Study, and Trustwave's Global Security Report. So the graph on this page is actually from the DBIR, the 2016 DBIR, which is their annual publication containing analyses of incidents and breaches. You can see the category of attack, so hacking, malware, social, air, misuse, physical, and environmental, and the respective pattern between 2005 and now. So you'll notice a lot of increases, hacking, malware, and social especially. So this much is pretty clear from the visual that the frequency of attacks, because this is actually count, has gone up way over the past, and it's continuing to rise. So everyone's at risk. I often hear many organizations believe they're too small, or they couldn't possibly be on anyone's radar, so they don't need to be as diligent. So analyses of breaches consistently show that malicious actors, they don't discriminate. So all industries and all sizes of businesses are targets. And you'll notice that, especially with a lot of the recent trends, they're not necessarily targeted at businesses, they're sort of targeted at technology. And so if you're using a specific technology that's targeted, the size of your business is pretty relevant. Cost. So this graph is actually from the 2016 Global State of Information Security Survey. So they asked respondents to quantify the financial impacts of their losses due to cyber incidents. So notice these buckets have some pretty big numbers. We've got $50,000, $100,000, $1 million sort of listed on this slide. So the bottom line is incidents are expensive, but if you manage them well, you can minimize your losses. So imagine if you have a breach and you could contain it in 3 weeks versus a breach that took you 6 months to contain. Obviously, the cost impacts of those two breaches are going to be considerably different. So the Ponyman 2016 cost of data breach study found on average that if you have an incident response team, the cost of your breach is actually reduced by 10%. So management, I think we've seen in the last few years that there's been more accountability in the management of cyber incidents. So many studies are showing that management, board members, et cetera, are more concerned about cybersecurity. It's coming up at boardroom level discussions. Unfortunately, the poll showed that 66% of management that was polled are actually not fully confident their companies are properly secured. So that's not a very good statistic that we're looking at. Another reason to work on your incident response planning is compliance. Many of you are affected by compliance and are required to meet these requirements. So one example being payment card industry compliance. So the PCI DSS requires that you have an incident response plan. So on the slide there are listed multiple requirements that not only that you have to have an incident response plan, but you also have to train your staff, you have to update your plan, and you have to test your plan annually at a minimum. And now I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who's going to talk about developing and implementing your incident response plan.
Thank you, Tabitha. In the next section here, I'm going to try to give you all a series of steps that you can use to develop, test, and improve your organization's incident response capabilities. I'm going to walk through this material shortly, but first, pardon me, you want to do the poll here?
I just kicked the poll off, so while he gets started, and then we'll let you do it while he's talking.
All right, so let me get back to it. As you're sitting here listening to this conversation, you're probably wondering where to start. I saw the results of the poll earlier that there's at least a few organizations out there that either don't have or don't know if they have an incident response plan. Still, the question is probably worth asking around in your organization, regardless of how you answer the previous poll. On the slide that she'll be showing here shortly, and I think it's the next page, if you would, Tabitha, I've got a little stair-step ladder of 5 questions that you can ask your organization, starting at the bottom left. First of all, does your organization have a plan? If not, a strong recommendation is to start that project immediately and use that statistic that Tabitha laid out there just a few minutes ago about the presence of a plan saving your money. I think your finance team will appreciate a little bit of economic foundation for your project. The second question, though, if your plan exists, is look at it for currency, determine if it's up to date. As Tabitha mentioned previously, it is a compliance requirement for those of you that have a PCI requirement, and as our assessors at Coal-Fired go out and talk to our clients and audit clients, we often see a mismatch between what's written in the plan and even something as basic as the current organization chart. And also, I think she also mentioned the importance of service providers. We often, your plan has to have names and contact information of all of your service providers, and that's another frequent finding that it's just out of date. You may have changed processors, you may have changed other service providers that you use. You just got to keep that current because you don't want to have to find contact information in a moment of need. The third question to ask, climbing the ladder a little further, is whether or not you've tested the plan annually. And again, without a test, an incident response plan is just a piece of shelfware. It's just something taking up weight on your desk, and it certainly doesn't do you much good. And in fact, now I'm not a lawyer, but some of the lawyers I've talked to have opined that the mere presence of a plan won't stand up as proof that you are exercising due care in your responsibilities. They want to see that you have documented evidence of testing that plan. So that's certainly something that we train our auditors to look for at Coal-Fired, not just that the plan exists and even that it's current, but that we also look for a library of test results and whatnot, and because we think that's in our client's best interest to have that to defend themselves in a bad situation. Now, the higher level questions 4, climbing the ladder a little further, is does your plan align with business goals and risk management objectives? And this is where we often get asked for templates. I'm going to just download one and use that as my plan. That's generally, well, that is categorically a bad idea because no two companies are really alike in terms of their appetite for risk, their managerial decisions about recovery times and recovery points, acceptable losses, standards of customer care, the way they handle their community relations, their investor team, whatever it is. Every company is different, and what you'll see as you get into the nitty-gritty of an incident response plan is that you got a lot of managerial decisions that are truly rooted in how your company wants to operate in the instance of a bad day, and so you got to make sure it's aligned with what senior management is looking for. And then lastly, when you've gone through the journey, when you've built a plan, when you've tested a plan, and you've done everything you can internally, there's still perhaps more that you can do to give you an extra ounce of assurance, and that is get a third party in there to benchmark it against best practices. And in particular, I'd encourage you to talk to outside counsel. Sometimes your legal team is a really good objective, able to offer an objective perspective on what your plan could or should entail. Okay, so that's how you determine what your starting point is. And if you go to the next slide, Tabitha. Thank you. I'm going to walk through a series of 4 steps from our friends at NIST, but first things first, I want to talk about your team. If you're organizing an incident response plan development effort, don't just tag it to your security team or your IT team. Please consider it a cross-functional project, include third parties, and make sure that you have specialty skills involved. As we talk about it, a incident or a security event is certainly involved with the topic of security and the underlying technology, and certainly your security team is going to be all over it and playing a key role, but you absolutely need to have people from operations, from legal, from communications, from operational support or technical support, not just the security people, but the entire IT team. And you're gonna also need to know law enforcement contacts and even human resources contacts, because often events like this are gonna involve the people on your team. So make sure that you have a cross-functional team both on the project and then named in the plan that comes out of the project. Next slide, please. For the rest of our discussion, and for the benefit of those of you that might be beginning your IRP development efforts, I'm going to start here at the beginning. And a great place to start, as with so much in the information security world, is with the guidelines published by the Computer Security Division of NIST. And NIST is a wing of the U.S. government's Department of Commerce. NIST publishes and maintains many guidance documents. The one of relevance to today's topic is a publication entitled Computer Security Incident Handling Guide, and it's cataloged as 861 Revision 2, as shown there on the chart. You can find this on the website. You can download it for free, and therein you'll find 70 pages of helpful concepts, definitions, considerations that will help you develop and maintain your incident response plan. And this is something that my company, Coalfire, leverages when we are hired to help people build and test their plans. The chart on the slide is taken straight from that guidance document, and it depicts a common way to describe the incident response life cycle, if you would. And you'll find that a well-developed plan has procedures and protocols for each of these steps. Those steps are preparation, detection and analysis, containment, eradication and recovery, and post-incident activity. And in the following slides, I'll try to add a little color to each step of the life cycle based on the work we get to do for our clients. Next slide, please. Okay, preparation. This is all the work that we get to do, that you get to do before an incident occurs. And if this work is done well, it'll enable you to efficiently recover from security events and incidents. And what you see here in the hexagons is a partial set of tasks and considerations that we invite our consultants to use to help their clients develop incident response plans. And as Allie said, you'll get these slides later, so I won't read every bullet point for you, but let me highlight a couple of things. Over on the left, I talk about defining your team and documenting everyone's role. One additional thing I'll add to that is make sure that you've appointed a leader, and then have a decision tree that clarifies an escalation path Often, many companies out there do have a security officer that they appoint as the leader of the team, but other companies without the luxury of having a security person, have to choose someone else, and sometimes it's the legal counsel, sometimes it's somebody else with an IT function, sometimes it's a general manager even. But make sure that you know who your leader is and what the decision rights of that leader are. A second point that I'm making on the slide is definitions. They are important, and I'll be honest, too many people throw around terms like incidents, security events, data breaches, privacy breach, and they treat them all as synonyms, as if they're all the same thing. They are not. In a well-designed plan, you will define those terms, and you can use the guidelines from NIST. But you need to calibrate your response according to the way you've classified and rated the potential business impact of events. And again, not even the Verizon data breach investigation report that Tabitha cited earlier. It's pretty clear there. Some of the statistics are related to incidents, some are related to events, some or breaches, and they in their study define those terms, and you'll want to make sure your plan articulates those as well. The third thing that you want to have, and I think I mentioned here, the policies and procedures. Make sure that you have that your plan references the short and sweet stated policies of management regarding incident handling, the statements of management intent, and then the longer and more voluminous set of procedures that are executed in varying circumstances. And to give you a few examples of those, a common sense procedure that you'll probably create a form for and have a very explicit procedure probably posted on a public SharePoint site is reporting an incident. There will be a form. Most companies have a form that an employee or a third party can use to report an incident. Then you'll have other procedures that are more technical, things like conducting forensics analysis or capturing forensics evidence. Those are for a later part of the process, and then between that, all of those procedures you want documented so that your employees, when under duress, know what to do. And lastly, I'll say it again, you're not really prepared for an incident until you've practiced handling one or more, and the requirements are say that you got to practice it annually. I think the best practice is companies practice it much more often, because you'll get some, the early practices are kind of managerial in nature, and the later practices you'll actually simulate technical events. Anyway, more about that later. If you go to the next slide, please. Next phase of the incident handling life cycle is entitled by NIST Detection and Analysis. And this is the work steps and procedures therein, which will be outlined in your IRP, will guide you through those early phases of sorting out, whether or not an incident has occurred and gathering information. And to be clear, this is often the most challenging part of incident handling. Most organizations are swimming with alerts and incidents. Many of us that are in the security field get lots and lots of bulletins and lots of alerts. And what the Verizon report consistently points out is there's a significant time between an attack, when an attack is initiated and when an attack is detected. And if you do these processes right, you have a chance to shorten that window and thus mitigate the damages. So the kind of things we look for in detective controls and threat analysis processes are just the articulation of the common attack vectors that you are trying to guard against, the presence and effectiveness of precursors and indicators, the presence of profiles and baselines of system activity, kind of like that Secret Service cliche that says, if you want to find counterfeit, you got to understand what the true currency looks like. Same's true for your computer systems. You got to know what normal behavior looks like so that you can detect anomalies. Event correlation, that's the connecting the various logs and systems one to the other, and having the technology and skills on your staff to connect them to sort out what events and to gather evidence. The categorization and prioritization process, again, not every event is is critical. You know, you'll have level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever scale you come up with. You'll have multiple scales of events, and you'll have to figure out how to prioritize them. You'll have notification processes, and you'll have analyses processes. So again, these are the collection of processes that you ought to have in place and articulated in your plan, so that your incident team is able to respond. And let me add a few color comments on the points I just rattled through. And again, it's regarding common attack vectors. No organization, including the people represented in our industry here, can develop step-by-step instructions for detecting and analyzing every possible incident. You'll want to concentrate on common attack vectors. You know, in our industry, certainly, every industry really suffers from things like lost equipment, the exploitation of web app vulnerabilities, the use of unauthorized credentials, malware that might get passed from email onto servers, and so on. Those are the ones that you make sure that even in your plan you're articulating what attack vectors your incident response plan is at least, and your organization is attempting to guard against. And I think I talked already about the precursors and indicators, but for those of you who might appreciate a little definition, precursors are those things that show anomalous activity, like sometimes hackers are out there running scans against your externally facing IPs, and those are kind of an early warning that you might be under attack. They're also the things that the bulletins and notices that you might get from US CERT or other notice companies. And the indicators are that's the ocean of alerts and controls that an organization typically puts in place and needs to monitor. And famously, some of the firms that have been breached found out later that they were getting all kinds of alerts, but just didn't have the capability or the technology to process them all. And so you want to make sure that whatever detective controls you have in place are being monitored as per your stated policies. Let me finish this slide off with a little bit of a story, and maybe this will illustrate the point. Detection and analysis activities that go on every day at your organization, they sometimes lead to unexpected findings. And so a simple example from one of our clients was a client that came to us worried about the presence of malware on their system. I think they had employees that clicked on some suspect email attachments and started noticing some behavior they were uncomfortable with. So they engaged our forensics team to conduct an analysis of disk and memory on a dozen or so workstations. And the good news in that case is that an incident was reported, it was dealt with, the forensics team looked at, captured evidence and did the analysis. And in fact, it was good news. There wasn't threatening malware on those machines. But while in the process of looking at that, we also found unauthorized traffic was being sent out over the network, and so really it spawned a new incident. And so that kind of triggered a next set of activities where logs were examined and an overuse of administrative accounts. People, they were using shared accounts and that were no longer needed, and those accounts were being used to pump things out, unauthorized traffic on the network, and they were able to quickly terminate and shut those off. And so, maybe that's just an example of a detective and a detective control in place, a analysis being commissioned, a new incident being detected and dealt with. And obviously, I think I'm telling a good story there. That when those processes are in place, there was no business impact, no public disclosure. It was just kind of routine work in the security world, and I think a success story for that particular client. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about containment, eradication, and recovery. So if you go to the next slide, please, Tabitha. This is the third phase, and the things we look for in designing the plan are the decision-making trees, the containment strategies themselves, an articulation of a company's risk appetite, the way the procedures and processes for handling evidence, the written and the remediation strategies, and the recovery options that are articulated for consideration of your team, and then of course the backup processes. And let me highlight a couple of those. From a decision-making standpoint, when an incident, I mean, clearly I think when an incident is detected, everyone's stress level goes up. It's everybody wants to get through it quickly, but the most important activity is to get it contained. And you know, you want to have procedures and documented guidelines for determining when a system should be shut down, when it should be disconnected, or perhaps have some aspects of the functionality of the system disabled to contain or minimize damage. And if those things are written down, your team can work through the options in a much more calm and decisive way. Another thing worth highlighting is the evidence gathering, as shown in the center of the slide. Of course, the primary reason for gathering evidence during an incident is to resolve it, and but keep in mind that that evidence will also be needed, or could be needed, for legal proceedings. And thus, make sure that your plan is reviewed in advance by your legal team, so that so people on your team understand how to keep logs, how to properly record the chain of evidence, and so that that evidence can be used for subsequent investigations and perhaps defensive actions. And then, you know, recovery options. Let me cover that briefly as well. The goal of your incident response plan is to return to normal operations and then to remediate the vulnerabilities that led to the incident. And a well-designed IRP will guide your team through the options and lead you to wise choices. Maybe a short story here. One of our clients discovered that they actually got a third-party report that customer usernames and passwords were compromised and published on one of the many websites out there. So they had a shucks moment. You know, how did those accounts get out on the web? And now, you know, now I have a customer complaint problem. And their plan called for, you know, they consulted their plan. They did an immediate password reset to protect those customers from compromise. You know, they did a forced reset of every customer account that they were managing. And then later, as time allotted, they were able to rebuild the web application that was compromised with using a fully patched version of the underlying software. So my point is that there was a two-step process. There was an immediate recovery option, and then there was a longer-term recovery option. And again, it was very helpful for that client to be able to consult that with some sense of calm and confidence as to how they wanted to respond to an incident or an event such as I've described there. And then lastly, let me talk about backup procedures, because we certainly live in a media cycle where there's plenty of news reports about ransomware. If you have reliable backups, which I sure hope everybody does, you might be able to ignore those ransom requests and restore the system to a state at a level of acceptable loss. You know, no one wants to lose transactions. No one wants to go through the you know, reprocessing activities. But you know, backup is and reliable backups that have been tested are certainly pretty darn important in this day of age. Okay, next slide, please. Now into the last phase of the incident life cycle, and this is the stuff that happens post-incident, afterwards. We want all of our clients to do after-action reports, to track metrics, to do post-mortem reviews, to know where and how long they retain their evidence. We want them to have a process for identifying and executing the corrective actions to make sure that the vulnerability that led to the compromise is fully remediated. And then this last one on here is information sharing, and by everyone being on this call, you're already part of an information sharing group. So let me highlight that. You know, as security people, we need to work together, and sharing information about the attacks that organizations endure and respond to is really a part of us growing our security and defensive capabilities as as an industry. And my hope, and the reason why my company and I think all of you participate in Conexxus, is that we're in this together, and we want to learn from each other, and we want to find ways to share information. And even the government's getting involved in creating incentives around that. So that's probably something to talk about with your legal team. All right, with that, Tabitha, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
I'm going to attempt to look at our poll responses. We'll see. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. So 100% of the people that have an incident response plan have tested their plan. So let me hide this. Make sure everybody, are we back to seeing the slides?
We are.
Good. So before I started, I actually wanted to note something about Chris said about information sharing. I think this is something that is coming up a lot. You're going to start hearing more of. I know many industries actually have share groups. One of the things I mentioned about the Oracle incident is something that Visa did. So Visa released what I call the IOCs, the indicators of compromise. This is, I think, the way that everybody wants information security to go, which is far more transparency. It's a lot easier if something happens to you if you, for example, share the IPs of the attackers so everybody else can check their logs to see if they have any activity from those IPs, block those IPs if they don't have any indication of activity. So information sharing is what everybody hopes the future will be. Of course, everybody doesn't want to share bad news or bad information, but it is probably one of the biggest tools towards combating incidents and breaches. So I'm surprised that 100% of you have tested your incident response plan. That's very good, although surprising. I also spent many years as a consultant, and usually an incident response plan was something that someone created once. They filed it away in a drawer, and they let it collect dust. So it's critical that your incident response plan is actually defined by actions. So you need to train your staff. You need to test your plan regularly. You need to modify your plan so it's effective. If you did something 3 years ago, as Chris said, something happens, everybody's super stressed out, you pull it out of the drawer, and it doesn't even have anybody's phone numbers in it that are relevant anymore. That's not going to get you very far. So also make sure that you actually involve everyone in the organization that needs to know what they need to do. For example, I think on one of the slides it had your PR firm. So if your PR firm doesn't know how to respond to an incident and they get a call, you want to make sure they properly communicate back to you so that you know that you may have an issue. So imagine if the PR firm is one example, but imagine at the lowest levels of your organization. Chris had mentioned that often your first exercise is sort of a management level exercise. So imagine if your system administrator didn't understand what your processes were and did not know how to report and didn't know you had a reporting portal or a SharePoint or a form because they weren't involved, and so they just didn't tell anyone. So you definitely need to make sure everybody's involved. You definitely want to make sure it's not just a management exercise and that everybody in your organization knows, from your help desk to your administrators to your PR to anybody who may get a call, may see something unusual, etc. It's also important that your incident response plan is relevant to your business. I think we have some brands on the call, for example. So you may have your own incident response plan for your systems. The question is, what about your retailers who are actually associated with your brand? Do they know what to do? Should you perhaps help them out by putting one sheet together that says, if you find a skimmer, call and do this. If you find a big skull flashing on your computer that says, give me your credit card information because I have all your files, call and do this. If somebody walks into your store, and this happens, it's crazy to me because I use my credit cards everywhere. But people will walk into a retail location and they'll say, my credit card was breached and it happened here, because apparently that's the only place they use their credit card. I had a customer once that had 3 people walk into their retail store on the same day and say, my credit card was breached and it happened here. So something like that happens. Does the location know who to call and what to do? One of the other things is templates. So everybody loves templates because they make things easier. Just be careful with your templates, because if you download a template from the internet and stamp your name on the top, the chance that it will be effective for your business is pretty low. Let me look at the time real quick. Okay. I did put aside some excerpts from a template, the dirty word that I just used, just so you can see some specifics. So for example, one of the things you're going to want to have, obviously, is a list of contacts and their current contact information, so people don't have to search around and try to figure out how to get a hold of someone. Chris also mentioned incident reporting form. So you need to document incidents, and he gave an example of an incident that wasn't a breach, right? And I've had stories like that. I once had a college university that ended up with a sort of a 0-day piece of malware on their e-commerce website, and they immediately executed their incident response plan, and it turned out that nothing had been compromised, right? So you also want to document those incidents, so suspected or actual. You also use this information to make sure there are no improvements that are needed to your plan. For example, if you had a certain incident that happened and nobody knew how to even start, that may be a gap in your plan. Here are literally a half a page and a half a page from probably about 10 different pages. So this shows you sort of specific processes and procedures that you should have. And it covers everything from dealing with an event, analyzing an event, determining if an actual event occurred or if it perhaps was a breach, protecting evidence. So there are defined steps for protecting evidence. You don't want to go into a system and try to quote-unquote fix things and destroy all the evidence for somebody to figure out what actually happened. Classification of incidents, documentation of the incidents, and notification. On here you see file FBI report, consumer notification, probably have legal notification. It's a lot of notification. And actually, Chris had mentioned consulting with your attorneys. There's federal laws, there's state laws, there's local laws, and a lot of them have to do with where your headquarters are and where your locations are. So probably the only person that could address all of those different issues would be an attorney. And I think that leaves us at our Q&A.
Thank you, Chris and Tabitha. You guys gave us a lot of really great information in a really short period of time. If y'all have any questions, go ahead and type them in the question box. I have one for y'all though. So I've heard the term PFI regarding forensics analysis of PCI data. Do I need to hire a PFI for all types of incidents?
So I can, Chris and I can probably answer this one. So whether or not you need to or want to, because those are two different things, hire a certified PCI forensics investigator, whether you have to will be defined by your acquirer. Whether you want to is a different matter. A lot of times you will maybe not be required, but want some sort of assurance. I sort of mentioned the Wendy's breach, where they initially found things in January, and things were still going on 6 months later. So doing due diligence is probably a good idea. If you think you have a POS breach, because you want to contain it in as short amount of time as possible.
Yeah, I would add to that the PFI process is part of the PCI, the payment card data security standard, and if you have a breach of that kind of data and it reaches a certain level, then yes, you will be asked by your processor to engage a PFI. But there are lots and lots of different types of security incidents and events that either don't involve card data but still might warrant forensics analysis, and that's why the market is full of forensics firms that have broad or different capabilities, and there's a finite number of PFI firms. They focus on PCI and card data. There are scads of forensics firms that, again, part of your plan should be identifying how you would engage with such a firm if and when you need one.
Okay, thank you. And another one, who typically leads an incident response team?
So I'll weigh in, and then I'll ask Tabitha to comment. It's often the security person. I'll be clear, and I think a model that we're seeing increasingly, though, is joint leadership between a security officer and a legal officer. Sometimes the general counsel, sometimes the delegate of the general counsel, but those are the kind of people that that can provide both the technical and have the operational connections to lead such a team.
And I'll just add, it really has to do also with size, and then the less staff you have, people may have multiple responsibilities, so this may be one of the multiple responsibilities, right?
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions out there? Okay, I think you can go to the next slide. Thank you. With that, I believe this concludes our webinar today. We'd like to thank everybody for attending. You can find Conexxus at our website, www.conexxus.org. You can email us, find them on LinkedIn, or follow us on Twitter. The next webinar is on September 15th, 2016, and we will be talking about Protecting Retail ATMs, a guide to preventing and detecting skimming. Just as a reminder, the slide deck will be provided if you complete the short survey that will be given to you after the webinar. Thank you all for coming.